This lesson continues the study of Exodus and all the 613 laws of Moses, but since most of the material consists of very detailed instructions on the tabernacle and the priestly garments, these chapters after 24 will only be briefly summarized. So we've got chapter 23 up here, and it opens with a warning against even listening to gossip, much less spreading it. Slander can't do much damage without people willing to hear it and repeat it. So the command is to demand evidence. So if you hear something that sounds like gossip, demand evidence. And if you don't, then you are an accomplice and you share the guilt of the slanderer. And then from this comes the next warning against following the crowd and making baseless accusations. And while most would agree that justice should not be perverted to favor the rich, Scripture also forbids perverting it for the poor. We see this all the time where people get off the hook for things because they don't have a lot of money, then they must not be guilty. We can't go to either extreme and make a mockery of justice. So the point seems to be then interrupted by verses 4 and 5 there to address a sin of omission. That is something you should have done but didn't. And that is if you see someone else's work animal wandering off, but you don't bother to return it to its owner just because the owner is someone you don't like. The same applies if the animal is injured or overburdened, it can't stand up, and the person you don't like is trying to help the animal up, and you do nothing to help. You don't lift a finger because that's your enemy and you don't care about their animal. So the Bible is being very practical and fair and just in these things. And then down in verse 6, it's back to partiality in a court of law, basically, but the flip side of it, just as it's wrong to side with the poor in a trial, even though the poor person is guilty, so also is it wrong to falsely condemn the poor when they're innocent just because you can get away with it. And that is far more common. We have, especially in the Western world today, we have people taking advantage of the poor because they know they can't afford a lawyer and get off the hook, so they settle. So the point is that no one should be wrongly acquitted or condemned because of their social standing or wealth or anything like that. And more than that, the common practice of accepting bribes is forbidden here. And this would apply even to foreigners, which was quite unusual in the ancient Near East and even the modern Near East and a lot of other places. Bribes are common, especially in those cultures. And the Bible has been forbidding this for thousands of years. Now we go down to verse 10. And this section is usually thought of as more of a religious law, but it has very practical benefits for society. Not only is every seventh day a Sabbath rest for people and animals, so also is every seventh year a Sabbath rest for the land itself. The land has a chance to rebuild its nutrients, and the wild animals and poor people can glean whatever grows on its own. It just isn't tilled or processed in the usual way that farmers would do. Failure to observe this command would eventually lead Israel being deported to Babylon for the number of Sabbath years the land had been robbed of. And that turned out to be 70 years total, which is how the prophet Daniel knew that the time had come for Israel to return to the promised land when, if you look in the book of Daniel, where he says that he was reading Jeremiah and it occurred to him that that time was almost up. So God will have his Sabbath rest that he demanded for the land, and even if it means deporting the whole country, so they'll leave it alone. So that's what that was all about from our perspective, will be as far as we haven't got to that in the scriptures yet. But then we go down here to verse 13. And the text kind of abruptly seems to turn to remind the people not to speak the names of other gods, and then it begins a section on annual religious feasts. So we're turning completely to things that are strictly religious observances. And there's a link in the description for details and dates on all the eventual feasts, but only 3 of them are mentioned here, that being Passover, and the second, unleavened bread, that begins the day after Passover and lasts for 7 days, or the day of Passover, and then tabernacles or booths, the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, is said here to be at the end of the year, But in Leviticus 23:24 or 34, it says it's in the 7th month. So we have to take year in this passage to refer to the end of the harvest season. So late September, early October, and that's the end. That's the harvest time. And I think, I'm not positive, but I think this is also why they have in Israel, at least not in this era that we're looking at, but later, developed 2 calendars, and one of them begins in the fall. So then they call that the head of the year. And they call that a civil calendar, but it doesn't make much sense to me because it is a religious calendar just as much, since this is said to be the end of the year, so it would also be the beginning of the next. And but actually, if you just look at the context, it means the end of the season, the end of the growing year. So now let's look down at verse 17. And it says, it has another reference to every male among you, which again is another reminder of Pharaoh's attempt to kill all the baby boys in Egypt among the Hebrews, and it's a reminder also about the other first fruits from crops and animals. And then to this is added the stipulation that a lamb must not be boiled in its mother's milk, and we can only speculate on the meaning, why it's put there, and why, what it symbolizes. And there's all sorts of speculation, but the scriptures really don't say a lot about that. It's a rule for some reason. Most likely it seems on the surface to be that either the animal has not been weaned yet, or that it's just wrong to use the mother's life-giving milk to take life. So who can say? But we'll move on to verse 20. And there's a clear break at this point to look to the future. The angel, you can see there, we're familiar with the term angel of the Lord, but in this context it's presumed to mean the same thing, even though it doesn't say angel of the Lord. And that phrase, of course, we know usually refers to Jesus, the person of the Trinity, to eventually incarnate as the ultimate Passover lamb. So that seems to fit very nicely in the context here. And of course, this is the one who will guide them into the land he's preparing for them. But there are conditions. The people have to listen to him, and the consequences depend on whether or not they do so. Again, this is a conditional covenant. So now let's go down to verse 23. And the people are warned that when they come to the promised land, currently occupied by the list of ethnic groups there, they must not worship their gods or behave as they do. God goes on in that section to point out that he cannot drive them out all at once, that is to say the current occupants, or the land would become desolate and wild animals would become a problem and attack people and so forth. And here again we go, well, why doesn't God just snap his fingers and clear the place out? For whatever reasons, that's not the way God does things. Everything is working through and around us for reasons sometimes he reveals and sometimes he doesn't. So we just have to trust him. So now down in verse 31 is where God defines the boundaries of the land. So let me try to put up a map here. This is kind of an average, there are people who say it has more of this, others that say it has less, depending on how terms are defined. But it's very close, if not the same, as the map that I showed in the Genesis series of lessons, where Abraham is told the extent of the land that was being granted to him. And this is pretty much the same thing. You can see there up in the upper left is the Mediterranean Sea, and then we have the Red Sea kind of left of center there, the long narrow one. The Sinai is where Israel has been camped, and it's going to be roughly, as you see, like again, that area on the screen, which is also labeled Saudi Arabia for the most part. But it does go up. Some have it go as far as Turkey, up on the north side of the Mediterranean. But at least we know the Euphrates River is mentioned, and the river of Egypt and, all these various things. So you can look at the map and look for other similar maps. If you do a search on them in images, you can find all sorts of different little variations, but that's roughly it. And of course, that's a much bigger area than they wound up with, and we'll find out why later. But at any rate, you can see those. There's a link in the description for that. So, as I said, the actual occupied area will turn out to be much smaller, and it will be because Israel is disobedient. But again, in the passage, people are warned not to worship the heathen gods or make alliances with the people there because, for reasons in the past and future, there will be run-ins with these people. They're just not supposed to make entangling alliances. And also not to leave any of the people in the land. And their failure to do this will cause them a lot of trouble and, as I said, reduce the area of land they would actually receive. Now we go down to chapter 24. And all of this up to this point has only been the writing out of the covenant. But now it needs to be signed by both parties. Again, a conditional, mediated covenant between two parties. So Moses, Aaron, and 2 others are supposed to bring the 70 elders of Israel with them to worship God from a distance, farther than the people, but not as far as Moses was going to go, because only he can come very close to God. But before they go, the people again affirm their acceptance of the terms, and then Moses builds this altar at the foot of the mountain, along with setting up 12 stones to represent 12 tribes of Israel. So they're all being very careful about these things, which is a good idea. And then in verse 6, Moses has sacrifices done, and then he takes the blood and divides it in half. He puts some in bowls, and then he sprinkles half of it on the altar. And then he reads aloud the whole covenant again, and the people affirm again their acceptance. So then, after their affirmation, he sprinkles some of the blood on them too, and this signs and seals the legal agreement. And this was common in ancient Near East practice. It symbolized the willingness to give one's own life should they break the agreement. So this was not them being gory or dark or anything. This was just them saying this is a very solemn and binding agreement, and that's how they did things. Now Moses and the others can go up to the mountain because this has been done, and that's where they see this appearance of God standing on something they can't really quite describe. You can see there, let's see, I think I forget exactly which verse, but it's down in verse 10, where it says that the God of Israel stood, and he was under his feet was something like lapis lazuli brick, is the way the Greek describes it, and like the firmament of heaven in purity. So we can only imagine what that looked like, but it does seem to be more of a manifestation or appearance and not the actual presence of God. So then once that has appeared, they sit down to have a sacrificial meal. So the animals are not wasted in sacrifice. People actually eat it. And this sharing of a meal, just like the blood sprinkling, was another typical element of solemn legal agreements. And this would be especially important involving a deity of whatever culture. So again, not uncommon, and again, not borrowing. This is just how things were done and how you did treaties and covenants in those days. So then down to verse 12. And Moses has gone on ahead, and he only brings Joshua with him, and they're going to receive the stone tablets of the law. They leave the elders in the care of Aaron and Hur, and all of them are to watch over the people while Moses and Joshua are gone. So at this time, those others go back, and then Moses and Joshua go on, and it says that the glory of God covers the mountain like a cloud for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, God calls to Moses, at which time this glory of God becomes more like an intense fire. So Moses goes into that, was a brave guy, because all the other people were so afraid before that they asked him to be their intermediary. And he stays there for 40 days. No, there's a lot that God has to tell him, but it's going to take 40 days. And there's a lot of other things that can go wrong in those 40 days outside of that. So down in chapter 25, it says that God begins to give instructions on furnishing the sanctuary or tabernacle, which was a portable temple to be set up according to very precise specifications, and it would be made with the finest materials. And this was to impress upon the people that God was among them per the covenant both parties had just agreed to. And it was served as kind of a throne room for official meetings. This is the place where people would go to talk to God. And the people did ask for a mediator, as I just mentioned, so this would be the point or place at which such mediation would take place. So they can't always be going to some, flaming mountain with loud trumpet sounds. So then down in verse 9 or 10, depending on, they have dual numbers here when there's some discrepancies. And the centerpiece of the tabernacle would be the famous Ark of the Covenant, whose description you could read in this section through verse 24. The Ark, as depicted in Raiders of the Lost Ark, really wasn't all that bad. It was a pretty good facsimile. And the passage goes on to describe all the various utensils and equipment and so forth needed for various ceremonies and sacrifices as well. Now, the specifications are going to go on through, I'm just going to roll this real quick, through chapter 26 into chapter 27. You're free to read through all those details if you like. And this is where the altar itself is described in this chapter 27. And then God adds that there's a courtyard area around the actual temple part. And it, even though it's a courtyard, has the same quality of materials and attention to detail. So nothing is held to be of low or base quality, even though it isn't the main part of the temple. And then we go to chapter 28. And here is where God turns to the matter of a priesthood, composed of Aaron and his sons. Aaron was likely chosen because he had already been functioning as a mediator for Moses. So it seemed natural, and he was with Moses all these times and speaking for him. So God chooses Aaron and his sons to be the first priests. The priests are assigned special garments of very high quality and precise detail, and certainly on a par with everything else associated with the tabernacle. And the description goes on for quite a long time. Now, Constable's notes, again linked in the description, has a lot of material on all this and all the symbolism and the materials and so forth, and you can check the links for also descriptions of artist conceptions of how this was all laid out. And then we go to chapter 29. 28 was pretty long. And this is where the ceremonies for consecrating the priests are described. But they will actually be described in more detail in Leviticus 8. So you can check there if you want. And then chapter 30, again, a pretty good distance away, continues with additional articles and utensils for the service in the tabernacle, and also rules for financing its upkeep. This stuff isn't cheap, and it needs maintenance, and people with skill have to take care of it. So God sets up a way to deal with that. And then chapter 31 is where God selects skilled workers for its construction, and the language there seems to indicate not only that they had skill, but that God also gave them special skill to do this work. And you can see in if we go down to verse 12, that's where God turns back from the priesthood to the people, who are reminded to honor the Sabbaths, and that the penalty for failing to do so is death. This is God, and he's to be taken seriously and honored as the one to whom everyone owes their life. So, strong penalty. It doesn't make sense to us, but again, that's why God has to be harsh sometimes and extreme, because we just don't get it. So, to further impress the permanence and seriousness of this covenant, God also writes on 2 stone tablets. These are called the tablets of testimony or witness, same meaning, same word in Greek at least. And it's a legal document. It's literally etched in stone. And it really doesn't say exactly what was written on them until chapter 34, verse 28. And both the Greek and Hebrew texts there say the 10 words rather than commandments. However, the Greek word there, logos, can mean statements or phrases as well as individual words. So it seems by consensus and studying the text that yes, it is the 10 commandments that are written on those stone tablets. As for their sizes, we do know that they will be placed inside the Ark of the Covenant, whose dimensions were given, and also that Moses was able to carry them in his arms. Some say that they each had half the 10 commandments, 5 on one, 5 on the other, but other people say that each stone had all 10 on them so that each of the two parties to the covenant would have their copy. So whichever way you want to take it, evidently Scripture doesn't think it's all that important to say, but the point is that God wrote it himself on those tablets. Now, in the next lesson, it's a good stopping point because we're going to find out what the people have been up to while these 40 days were going on. And we will undoubtedly hear the sound of God face-palming over these people with whom he just went to a lot of trouble to make a covenant. And they agreed and agreed and agreed, and they did all these ceremonies, and nobody died for touching the mountain or doing anything. They were very, very good. But we know how long those things last. But why did he go at all that trouble, especially knowing how these people are? As we're told in Hebrews 8:5 and 9:23, the earthly temple and everything about it had to be made precisely as God instructed because they represented what is in heaven. That's the reason for all this detail, all this work, and all this costly material, and following very precise instructions because they represent something going on in heaven. There is a temple there. You can read more about that in Revelation, about all the precious gems that the Apostle John is trying to use as a comparison for what he's seeing. And gold is pure as transparent as glass, and so forth. And so we can only imagine there is a temple there. It will be brought down to earth eventually. But for the time being, the earthly temple was supposed to be a facsimile to represent it, and it had to be done exactly so. So that's why God goes into all that detail. But, as we'll find out, things always go wrong. Not God's fault. But we have to trust him for having reasons for all this, and that, knowing he's gone to all this trouble and people are going to pretty much throw it away anyhow, but he does what he does because he makes promises and he keeps them, and that's why he's still not done with the physical nation of Israel. We just have to trust him, and that's what it always boils down to. Even then, even though the quote-unquote concept of salvation didn't mean then what it means now, because most of the time, if you look at the promises that I think I've mentioned in earlier lessons, what God promised to Abraham and what he's promising to the people here has very little to do with the afterlife. People aren't talking about death and the grave. They're talking about how things are on this earth and physical geography that can be identified by rivers and such. So, as I've mentioned before, this concept of the afterlife really wasn't central to what any of these patriarchs were going through. Of course, everybody, as I mentioned, knew there was an afterlife and that they would see God again after their death, but really not a lot of detail about it. And this conditional covenant has everything to do with the here and now. But they do have eternal consequences, but right now, God is not as concerned with that. He's concerned with how things are happening in this realm where we were created to live. So next time, we'll find out how fast and far Israel can go after they've gone to all this trouble and seen all these miracles.